David Ross knew the ship was dying long before anyone else admitted it. Every grinding noise in the ventilation system, every flicker in the corridor lights, every strange smell from the recyclers told him the same story. Meridian's hope was falling apart, and no amount of repair work could save her much longer. He pressed his hands against the cold metal wall of the engineering bay and felt the vibrations running through the hull. Wrong vibrations, the kind that meant structural failure somewhere deep in the frame. Behind him, the other 11 survivors argued about their options, but David already knew what would happen. They would land on the planet below or they would die up here in the void. The decision came 3 hours later. The planet hung in the view screen like a green and blue promise, forests covering most of the visible surface. No cities, no lights, no signs of civilization, just wilderness and the faint hope of breathable air. David strapped himself into his seat in the engineering section and waited for the descent to begin. The atmosphere caught them hard. David felt the ship shudder as heat built up around the hull, heard the screaming of metal pushed beyond its limits. Then came the sound he had been dreading. A deep groan that ran the length of the ship, followed by a crack like thunder. The hull was splitting. Everything went sideways, literally. David's section of the ship tore away from the main body and tumbled through the air. He saw flashes of green through the viewport, spinning trees and sky mixing together until he could not tell which way was up. The impact knocked all sense from his head. Darkness took him for a while. Pain brought him back. His left arm burned with a deep ache that told him something was broken. David opened his eyes and saw twisted metal above him. Pieces of the engineering bay crumpled like paper. Smoke drifted through the wreckage, and somewhere nearby he heard a small fire crackling. He pulled himself free with his good arm, dragging his body through a gap in the hull. Outside, the forest waited. The trees were unlike anything from Earth. Their trunks were dark and smooth, but their leaves were crystalline, catching the purple light from the strange sky and throwing tiny rainbows across the ground. The air tasted clean and slightly sweet, filled with scents he could not name. David found his emergency pack still strapped to his station. Inside were basic supplies: water for 3 days, protein bars for maybe 5 days if he rationed carefully, a basic medical kit, and a small radio that looked mostly intact. He fashioned a sling for his broken arm using strips of fabric from a seat cushion and swallowed 2 painkillers dry. The radio crackled with static when he turned it on. He tried every channel but got nothing except occasional bursts of noise that might have been voices or might have been interference. He was alone, at least for now. Night came fast on this world. One moment the purple sky was bright, and the next it was fading to a deep violet that bordered on black. David gathered what he could from the wreckage and pulled himself back inside the broken hull, sealing the gaps as best he could with torn metal panels. That was when he heard them. The sounds came from all around his shelter, low calls that started like wolf howls but ended in clicking patterns that were too complex, too organized to be simple animal noises. David peered through a crack in the hull and saw eyes reflecting the dim light from his emergency lamp. Dozens of eyes all around him, all watching. The creatures moved like shadows between the crystalline trees. David caught glimpses of them. 6-legged bodies about the size of large dogs, sleek and built for speed. Glowing markings ran along their spines, pulsing in patterns that seemed to match their vocalizations. They were communicating with each other, coordinating something. David's hand tightened on the metal pipe he had grabbed as a makeshift weapon. The creatures circled his position for hours, never attacking, just watching and calling to each other. He realized with growing dread that they were studying him, learning his patterns, figuring out his weaknesses. He did not sleep that first night. Morning came with the same purple light, and the creatures were still there. David counted at least 20 of them visible in the surrounding forest. They had settled into positions around his shelter, some lying down like they were prepared to wait days if necessary. One of them sat directly in front of the gap he had been looking through, staring at him with intelligence that made his skin crawl. The second day was worse. David's water was running low, and he knew he would have to leave the shelter soon to find more. But every time he made the slightest noise, the creatures outside responded, shifting positions and calling to each other. They were coordinating, planning, waiting for him to make a mistake. On the third day, his radio picked up a fragment of a voice. Another survivor, somewhere out there in the forest. The signal was weak and broken, but it was human. David was not alone on this planet, but neither were the creatures who hunted him. He saw more of them now, emerging from the forest in small groups. They were pack hunters, and they had found their prey. David Ross was going to have to make a choice soon, stay in his shelter and die of thirst or venture out and face whatever was waiting for him. The pack was patient, and the pack was hungry. David closed his eyes and tried to think of a plan that did not end with him being torn apart in the alien forest. Outside, the creatures with the glowing spines settled in to wait. Thirst makes decisions for you when hunger is still just an ache. David stared at his last water bottle, already half empty, and knew he could not wait another day. The creatures outside had not left. If anything, more had arrived during the night, drawn by calls from the original pack. He spent the morning watching them through the gaps in the hull. They moved with purpose, taking turns resting while others kept watch. Their communication was constant. Low howls mixed with clicking sounds and body language that was too complex to be mindless. These were not simple predators. They were intelligent hunters working together. One of them caught his attention. Smaller than the others, it moved with a limp that favored its right side. Even from a distance, David could see the wound. A long gash ran down its flank, the fur matted with dried blood. The other creatures seemed to avoid it, stepping around it when it got too close, turning away when it tried to approach. The injured one settled down apart from the main pack, watching David's shelter from a distance. Its glowing spine markings were dimmer than the others, pulsing irregularly like a failing light. David made his choice. He could not outrun them, could not outfight them, but maybe he could communicate. Maybe intelligence meant the possibility of something other than killing. He unwrapped one of his precious protein bars and broke it into small pieces. Then slowly he pushed his good arm through a gap in the hull. The nearest creatures immediately tensed, their spine markings flaring brighter. David kept his movements slow and deliberate. He placed a piece of protein bar on the ground outside the gap and pulled his arm back. Nothing happened for several minutes. The creatures watched the food, watched him, communicated with each other in their complex language. Then one of the larger ones approached, sniffed the protein bar and backed away without eating it. It made a series of clicks and the others responded. They knew it was food. They were choosing not to take it. David tried again. This time he held the food in his open palm, keeping his hand visible through the gap. Still nothing. The creatures were too smart to be baited, too cautious to trust something a trapped human offered them. Then the injured one moved. It limped forward slowly, separated from the main pack by several meters. The other creatures watched but did not follow. The injured one approached David's outstretched hand, its nose working as it caught the scent of the food. David stayed perfectly still. His arm ached from holding it extended, but he did not move. The injured creature came closer, eyes locked on his. This close, David could see the intelligence behind those eyes. Not animal cunning, but something deeper. Awareness. Understanding. The creature took the food gently from his palm. For a moment, they stayed like that. Human and alien connected by an exchange that meant more than either of them fully understood. Then the creature backed away and swallowed the food. The other creatures erupted in calls and movement. They surrounded the injured one, pushing it away from David's shelter, driving it back toward the forest. The injured one resisted at first, then gave in and retreated, but it did not go far. It settled down at the edge of the clearing, still watching David's shelter. Night fell again. David managed to sleep for a few hours, exhaustion finally overwhelming his fear. When he woke, the purple sky was just beginning to lighten. He looked through the gap and froze. The injured creature was lying right outside his shelter, so close he could have touched it. The rest of the pack was gone. Not completely gone. David could still see shapes moving in the distant trees, but they had withdrawn. They had left the injured one behind. David understood. The pack had made a decision. The wounded member was a liability, slowing them down. Unable to hunt effectively, they had abandoned it to die, the same way they had been waiting for David to weaken enough to become easy prey. He crawled out of the shelter slowly. The injured creature watched him but did not move away. In the growing light, David could see the wound more clearly. It was deep but clean, probably from a fight with another predator. Infected? Maybe, but not badly yet. David opened his medical kit with one hand, his broken arm still useless in its sling. He had antiseptic wipes, bandages, and not much else. Hardly enough for himself, let alone an alien creature, but he thought about the food he had shared, about the intelligence in those eyes. He approached slowly. The creature tensed but did not flee. David knelt beside it and reached out with the antiseptic wipe. The creature flinched at the first touch, a low growl rumbling in its chest. David kept talking even though it could not understand his words. Tone mattered. Intent mattered. He cleaned the wound as best he could, working carefully around the torn flesh. The creature stayed still, trembling slightly but allowing him to work. David tore strips from his own shirt and wrapped them around the injury, creating a makeshift bandage. Then he pulled off his belt and fashioned it into a splint for the creature's injured leg. When he finished, the creature looked at him with those intelligent eyes and made a soft sound, nothing like the hunting calls from before, something gentler. David reached out slowly and touched its head. The creature leaned into his hand. David named it Scout in his mind, though he had no idea if it was male, female, or something else entirely. His water was gone now. His supplies were almost exhausted, but for the first time since the crash, David Ross did not feel completely alone. Scout stood up carefully, testing her bandaged leg. She looked at David, then toward the forest, then back at David. She was offering to lead him to water. David grabbed his pack and followed Scout into the alien forest, leaving his shelter behind. The rest of the pack was still out there somewhere, still watching. But now David had an ally who knew this world, who understood survival. The hunt had changed. Neither of them were prey anymore. Water sang through the forest. David heard it before he saw it, a gentle trickling sound that cut through the clicking of crystalline leaves overhead. Scout led him down a slope where the purple light filtered through the canopy in strange patterns, making everything look like a fever dream. The stream was real enough, though. Clear water flowing over smooth stones that glowed faintly with some kind of bioluminescence. David knelt at the edge and drank deeply, finally satisfying the thirst that had driven him from his shelter. The water tasted clean with a slight mineral tang that was not unpleasant. Scout drank beside him, lapping at the water carefully to avoid disturbing her bandages. David watched her and realized how much had changed in just a few hours. Yesterday she had been part of a pack hunting him. Today she was showing him how to survive. He refilled his water bottles and looked around properly for the first time. The forest was dense but not impossible to navigate. The crystalline leaves chimed softly when the wind moved through them, creating an ever-present music that was both beautiful and alien. Strange plants grew in the shadows, some with flowers that pulsed with their own light. David pulled out his radio and tried again. Static greeted him at first, then a fragment of a voice. He adjusted the frequency carefully, nursing the signal until words became clear. Anyone receiving this transmission. This is Dr. Ann Miller from Meridian's Hope. I am alive but trapped. The creatures have surrounded my position. I need help. Please, if anyone can hear this, and the signal faded. David tried to respond but got no acknowledgement. His transmitter was weaker than his receiver, damaged in the crash. But he had heard her. Ann Miller, the ship's doctor. She was alive and in danger. Scout made a questioning sound. Her head tilted as she watched David fiddle with the radio. He looked at her and made a decision. Ann had helped him once, setting his broken wrist during a training accident. He owed her. More than that, she was human and alone. We need to find her, David said to Scout, knowing she could not understand his words but hoping his tone would convey meaning. He pointed in the direction the signal had come from and started walking. Scout followed without hesitation. They traveled for hours through the alien forest. Scout knew paths David would never have seen, routes through the dense undergrowth that made the journey easier despite his injured arm. She would stop occasionally, testing the air with her nose, listening to sounds David could not hear. Several times she led him on detours around obstacles he only recognized as dangerous when he saw the territorial markers left by other creatures. Late in the afternoon, they encountered Scout's former pack. 3 of them stepped out from behind the crystalline trees blocking the path. They were larger than Scout, their spine markings pulsing in aggressive patterns. The lead one, with scars across its muzzle, locked eyes with David and growled low in its throat. David's hand tightened on the metal pipe he still carried. It would be useless against 3 of them, but it was all he had. Scout stepped forward, positioning herself between David and her former pack members. Despite her injury, despite being outnumbered, she faced them down. The scarred one made a series of complex calls. Scout responded with her own vocalizations, a back and forth that sounded almost like an argument. The other two pack members circled slowly, trying to get around Scout to reach David. She moved to block them each time, her body language clear even if David could not understand the sounds. The standoff lasted several minutes. David could see the calculation in the scarred one's eyes. It wanted to attack, wanted to prove Scout's choice was wrong, but something held it back. Maybe the strangeness of the situation, maybe respect for a former pack member, maybe simple confusion about why prey and predator were working together. Finally, the scarred one made a sharp sound and turned away. The other two followed after a moment's hesitation. They disappeared into the forest, but David knew they would be watching, waiting to see what happened next. Scout made a soft sound and continued forward. David followed, his heart still racing from the encounter. They had been seconds from violence, and only Scout's intervention had stopped it. As the sun began to set, painting the purple sky in shades of deep violet, David's radio crackled to life again. Anne's voice came through clearer this time. "This is Dr. Ann Miller. The creatures are trying to get into the cave. I estimate I have maybe 12 hours before they find a way through. Please, if anyone is out there, I need help." David looked at Scout. She looked back at him with those intelligent eyes. Without a word between them, they picked up their pace. The forest grew darker as night fell, but Scout's spine markings provided a gentle glow that helped David see the path. Other lights appeared in the darkness around them, more of the creatures moving through the trees. They were being watched, followed. David counted at least a dozen sets of glowing markings keeping pace with them through the forest, but none attacked. The creatures seemed content to observe this strange alliance, uncertain what to make of a human and a cast-out pack member traveling together. David's last protein bar was split between him and Scout as they rested briefly near midnight. He held half out to her and she took it gently, the same trust from their first exchange. They ate together in the darkness while the eyes of the pack watched from the shadows. Ann Miller was somewhere ahead, trapped and afraid. David Ross was injured and almost out of supplies. Scout was an outcast with an infected wound. None of them should have survived this long. But David had learned something important. Intelligence created choices. Kindness could change outcomes. And sometimes the most unexpected alliances were the ones that mattered most. They continued through the night, human and alien walking side by side, while the pack followed at a distance, watching and learning. Dawn broke over a landscape David did not recognize. The forest had changed during the night, the trees growing more twisted and strange. Some of the crystalline leaves had lost their shine, hanging limp and discolored. Dead vegetation littered the ground and the air carried a faint smell of decay. Scout had noticed it too. Her movements became more cautious, her nose working constantly as she tested the air. Whatever was killing this part of the forest, it made her nervous. David's radio gave him a bearing on Anne's position. They were close now, maybe an hour away, but the creatures following them had multiplied. David counted at least 30 distinct sets of glowing markings in the morning light. They were no longer just Scout's old pack. Multiple groups had joined together, all focused on David and Scout. The forest opened onto a rocky area studded with cave entrances. Scout stopped at the edge of the clearing and made a low warning sound. David saw why. Creatures surrounded one particular cave, at least 20 of them positioned around the entrance. They were not attacking, just watching and waiting. Anne was in there. David tried his radio. "Dr. Miller, this is David Ross. Can you hear me?" Static answered him at first, then Anne's voice, shaky but alive. "David, oh thank God. Are you real? Is this really happening?" "I'm here. I'm at the edge of the clearing with the caves. I can see them surrounding your position. They've been there for 3 days. Just watching, waiting. David, I'm out of food. My water is almost gone. What are they waiting for?" David looked at Scout, at the gathered creatures, at the dying forest around them. "I don't think they're waiting to kill you. I think they're trying to figure you out." He explained quickly about Scout, about the alliance they had formed, about the encounters with the other packs. Anne listened in silence. "You're saying these things are intelligent enough to negotiate with? I'm saying they're intelligent enough to make choices. Whether they'll choose to help us or hurt us, I don't know yet." Scout made a sound and started forward. David followed, walking openly into the clearing toward the assembled creatures. Every spine marking flared brighter as they approached. Low growls rumbled through the group, but none attacked. The scarred one from yesterday stepped forward. It was clearly a leader, the way the others deferred to it. The creature studied David and Scout for a long moment, then made a complex series of calls. Other creatures responded, a conversation happening that David could only guess at. Scout answered, her vocalizations different from before. Longer, more detailed. She was explaining something, telling the pack about David's actions. The scarred leader listened, then made a sharp sound. Two younger creatures approached David. They moved to either side of him, not threatening but clearly guiding. They wanted him to follow. Scout stayed close, her body language tense but not aggressive. They led David past the cave where Anne was hiding, deeper into the rocky area. David's hand stayed on his metal pipe, ready for anything. The creatures brought him to a small clearing where the morning light fell on something that made David's breath catch. A young creature lay on the ground, its breathing labored and shallow. Its spine markings barely flickered. Wrapped around its back leg was salvage netting from the crashed ship, the synthetic fibers cutting deep into flesh that had swollen around them. The young one had been caught for days, maybe longer. It was dying. The adult creatures surrounded the young one, clearly distressed but unable to help. Their claws and teeth could not cut through the material without causing more damage. They had found a problem they could not solve. David understood. This was a test, a question, and maybe a plea all at once. Could the strange human with his tools and his gentleness toward Scout do what they could not? He knelt beside the young creature. It tried to struggle but was too weak. David pulled out his multi-tool, the blade small but sharp. "Easy," he said softly. "I'm trying to help." He cut carefully, sawing through the netting strand by strand. The material was tough, designed to survive atmospheric entry. It took several minutes to cut through each section. The adult creatures watched in absolute silence, their full attention on David's hands. When the last strand parted, the young creature kicked free. David pulled the netting away and examined the damaged leg. Bad, but not beyond healing. He cleaned the wound with his last antiseptic wipe and used the rest of his shirt to create a bandage. The young creature stumbled to its feet and immediately ran to the adults, who surrounded it with gentle sounds and nuzzling movements. The scarred leader watched this reunion, then turned its attention back to David. The creature approached slowly. David stayed still, barely breathing. The scarred one studied him with those intelligent eyes, then did something unexpected. It touched its nose to David's hand, a gesture of acknowledgement or respect, or perhaps something that had no human equivalent. Scout made a sound, and the scarred leader responded. More vocalizations followed, rippling through the assembled creatures. Something had shifted. David could feel it in the air, in the way the creature's body language changed from threatening to something else. Curiosity, perhaps, or the beginning of trust. The scarred leader turned and walked toward Anne's cave. It made a specific call, and the creatures surrounding the entrance moved aside. An invitation. A command. David was being told to get his person and bring her out. David approached the cave entrance carefully. "Anne, it's safe. They're letting you go." Anne appeared at the cave mouth, dirty and exhausted but unharmed. She stared at the assembled creatures, at Scout standing beside David, at the impossible situation she found herself in. "David, what did you do?" "I helped one of their young. I showed them we can be useful for more than just meat." The scarred leader made another call, and several creatures moved forward. They dropped items at David's feet. Small game they had hunted, killed, and ready to eat. An offering, a gift. The first exchange in what might become a partnership. Scout picked up one of the kills and brought it to David. He accepted it, and in that moment something fundamental changed in the forest. Prey and predator had become something new. Anne built a fire from the salvaged materials David had brought, and they cooked the meat the creatures had provided. The scarred leader, who David had started calling Silver in his mind, watched the process with intense interest. The other creatures kept their distance from the flames, their spine markings pulsing in what David recognized as fear or anxiety. "They're terrified of fire," Anne observed, eating her first real meal in days. "But they're watching you use it," David nodded. He was learning their body language, starting to understand the patterns in their communication. The creatures were not just intelligent. They were adaptive, capable of learning new concepts if those concepts were demonstrated properly. Over the next 2 days, David and Anne worked to establish a basic camp near the cave system. Silver's pack brought them food regularly, always presenting it as gifts rather than leaving it like scraps. In exchange, David treated injuries among the creatures. A torn ear here, an infected paw there. Small things, but each act of care reinforced the fragile alliance. Scout remained David's constant companion, her wound healing well under the makeshift bandages. She had become a translator of sorts, her vocalizations helping bridge the gap between human intentions and pack understanding. On the third day, David's radio picked up new signals. Other survivors from the crash scattered across the forest. The captain was alive, along with at least 3 crew members. They were trying to regroup, but the forest and the creatures made movement dangerous. David tried to explain the situation to Silver. He pointed to the radio, mimicked voices, gestured to the forest. Silver watched intently, then made a series of calls to the pack. Several creatures broke away and disappeared into the trees. "What just happened?" Anne asked. "I think he sent scouts to find the other humans." Anne stared at him. "David, do you realize what you're suggesting? These creatures are coordinating with us. That's not just intelligence. That's cooperation at a level that implies social complexity we barely understand." David looked at the dying forest around them, at the discolored leaves and diseased trees. "I think they're desperate, Anne. This forest is sick. Their food sources are disappearing. We showed up and they saw something they needed. Not food, tools, knowledge, a different way of surviving." Anne stood up and walked to the edge of their camp. She pulled a sample from one of the diseased trees, examining the bark carefully. Her medical training included some biology, and David watched her face change as she studied the damage. "This is a fungal infection, aggressive, spreading through the root systems. It's killing everything." She turned back to David. "If this continues, this entire ecosystem will collapse. The creatures will starve. Can we stop it?" Anne was quiet for a moment. "Maybe. Controlled burns to eliminate infected areas. Introduction of beneficial organisms to compete with the fungus. Basic ecological management. But David, we're talking about months of work. We'd need help from the other survivors. We'd need these creatures to trust us completely." Silver approached as if sensing the importance of their conversation. The creature made a questioning sound, its eyes moving between David and Anne. David knelt to Silver's level and pointed at the diseased trees. He mimicked sickness, weakness, death. Then he pointed to himself and Anne and mimicked strength, health, growth. Silver's response was immediate. The creature turned and made a long, complex call that echoed through the forest. Within minutes, creatures began emerging from the trees. Not just Silver's pack, but others. Dozens of them, all gathering in response to Silver's summons. They wanted help. They were asking for it. Over the next week, the survivors were brought together. The captain, a tough woman named Patricia Walsh, arrived first, escorted by 5 creatures who had found her camp. She was followed by 3 other crew members, all exhausted and half-starved but alive. The reunion was emotional, but there was no time for celebration. David explained the situation quickly. The forest was dying. The creatures were intelligent and willing to cooperate. Survival for both species depended on fixing the ecosystem. "You're asking us to trust alien predators," Patricia said bluntly. "Predators who were hunting us a week ago." "I'm asking us to be more than prey," David replied. "These creatures are smart enough to understand mutual benefit. They brought you here safely, didn't they?" Patricia looked at Silver, who sat patiently nearby with Scout. The captain was a practical woman. She nodded slowly. "What do you need?" David, Anne, and the other crew members began analyzing the blight systematically. They collected samples, tested the fungus, mapped the spread. The creatures helped, showing them areas of the forest that were most affected. Scout proved invaluable, communicating between David and Silver when gestures were not enough. The solution was simpler than David had hoped, but more challenging than he had feared. Controlled burns would work, but the creature's fear of fire was instinctual and deep. Teaching them to accept fire as a tool rather than a threat would require trust beyond anything they had established so far. David planned carefully. He cleared a small area in the infected zone and built barriers from stones. Then he started a small controlled fire inside the barriers. The creatures immediately retreated, their spine markings flashing in alarm. Silver growled low, torn between trust and instinct. David walked into the fire. He had wrapped himself in a salvaged, heat-resistant tarp from the ship, and he moved through the flames without harm. Scout watched from the edge of the clearing, whining softly. She wanted to follow, but her fear held her back. David called to her, not with words, but with the tone they had developed together. Trust, partnership. Scout took one step forward, then another. Silver made a sound like a command, trying to stop her. But Scout kept moving. She walked to the edge of the fire, then through it to reach David. The tarp protected them both. David led Scout through the flames and out the other side, demonstrating that fire could be controlled and survived. The gathered creatures erupted in calls, but Silver silenced them with a sharp bark. The pack leader approached the fire. For a long moment, Silver stood at the edge, fear and trust warring in those intelligent eyes. Then the creature stepped forward, following the path Scout and David had taken, walking through the controlled flames. When Silver emerged unharmed on the other side, everything changed. 3 months changed everything. The burned sections of forest were already showing new growth, healthy shoots pushing up through the ash. The fungus had retreated, unable to compete with the beneficial microorganisms Anne had cultivated from healthy soil samples. The crystalline trees were recovering, their leaves beginning to chime properly again in the wind. David stood at the edge of the human settlement and watched the sun set over the alien landscape. It was not Earth. It would never be Earth. But it was home now, and that meant something. The settlement had grown from salvaged ship parts and local materials. 15 humans living in structures that blended human engineering with knowledge, learned from watching how the creatures built their dens. Solar panels from the ship powered basic systems. Water came from the streams the creatures had shown them. Food came from hunting partnerships and the early experiments in agriculture that Anne was leading. Scout appeared at his side, no longer limping. Her wound had healed completely, leaving only a scar under her fur. She made a soft sound and leaned against his leg. David scratched behind her ears, a gesture she had learned to enjoy. "Still can't believe this actually worked," Patricia said, walking up to join them. The captain had adapted well to their new reality, taking charge of organizing the settlement and establishing protocols for human-creature cooperation. "It worked because we gave them a reason to see us as something other than food," David replied, "and because they were smart enough to recognize mutual benefit." Movement in the forest caught their attention. Silver emerged leading a group of younger creatures, including the one David had freed from the netting. The young one had grown in 3 months, nearly the size of the adults now. It approached David without fear and dropped something at his feet, a large kill, fresh and cleanly taken, the finest meat from a successful hunt. David knelt and examined the offering. This was not desperation or tribute. This was pride. The young creature was showing David what it had learned, sharing its first major kill the way pack members shared with family. "Thank you," David said softly, knowing the words meant nothing but the tone meant everything. He accepted the gift with both hands, a gesture of respect the creatures had taught him. Silver made a complex vocalization, and Scout responded. The exchange went back and forth several times before Scout turned to David and made a specific sound pattern they had been working on. "An invitation. A request. They want us to come to the gathering," Anne said, appearing from one of the settlement buildings. She had been spending more time with Silver's pack than anyone else, studying their social structures and learning their communication methods. "The seasonal gathering. All the packs come together. They want humans to attend," Patricia frowned. "Is that safe?" "How many packs are we talking about?" "At least 8 different groups that we know of. Maybe 200 individuals total. And no, I don't know if it's safe. But I think refusing would be an insult. They're inviting us to a sacred social event. This is them accepting us as part of their world." David looked at Scout, at Silver, at the young creature who had just shared its first hunt with him. "We should go, all of us. We show them we trust them the same way they've learned to trust us." The gathering took place in a wide valley where the crystalline trees grew tallest. David had never seen so many creatures in one place. They filled the valley, their spine markings creating a sea of bioluminescent light in the purple twilight. Different packs maintained some separation, but there was clear socialization happening between groups. The humans walked into the valley together, 15 people among 200 predators. It should have been terrifying. Instead, it felt like being welcomed home. Silver led them to a central area where the pack leaders had gathered. David recognized several of them from various encounters over the past months. They acknowledged the humans with sounds and gestures that Anne was slowly learning to interpret. The ceremony that followed was complex and beautiful. The creatures sang, their vocalizations blending together in harmonies that resonated through the valley. They performed ritual hunts, displaying coordination and skill that left the humans in awe. Young creatures were presented to the assembled packs, the equivalent of children being introduced to the community. Then Silver did something unexpected. The pack leader called forward the young creature David had saved from the netting. Silver made a long vocalization that seemed to tell a story, gesturing to David several times. When it finished, other pack leaders responded with their own calls. Scout translated as best she could through the limited vocabulary she and David had developed. David understood enough. Silver was telling the story of the humans' arrival, of David's kindness to an injured outcast, of the cooperation that had saved the forest. The story was becoming part of the creature's oral history, a tale that would be passed down to future generations. When the ceremony ended, the creatures brought food. Not offerings, but a communal feast where everyone ate together. Humans and creatures sat side by side, sharing meat from successful hunts. Young creatures played with human children who had been born in the settlement, learning each other's boundaries through play that was both alien and universal. David found himself sitting next to Silver, with Scout on his other side. The pack leader pushed a choice cut of meat toward him, and David broke off a piece to offer back. They ate together. Predator and prey transformed into something that had no easy name. Anne sat nearby with several creatures gathered around her, all of them watching with fascination as she sketched anatomical drawings in the dirt. Patricia was engaged in what looked like a serious discussion with two other pack leaders, probably negotiating hunting boundaries or resource sharing. The settlement was growing. 2 more humans had been found, survivors who had been hiding in the deep forest. Anne was pregnant, the first child who would be born fully into this new world. The creatures were teaching humans their language while learning human words in return. Agricultural experiments were succeeding beyond expectations. The forest was healing. Scout made a contented sound and rested her head on David's lap. He looked up at the alien stars in the purple sky and thought about the word home. It was not about the planet you were born on. It was about the bonds you formed, the community you built, the trust you earned. The pack had been hungry, but human kindness had offered something better than prey. It had offered partnership, cooperation, and the possibility of building something new together. Silver raised its head and made a long, melodic call. The other creatures joined in, their voices blending together in a song that celebrated survival, community, and the strange miracle of 2 species learning to share one world. David added his own voice to the song, knowing it did not matter that he could not match their tones. What mattered was the choice to sing together. The hunt had ended. The feast had begun, and in a dying forest on an alien world, a new kind of family had learned to thrive.